Welcome to a new video in my home automation series, and today I want to talk about Arduino OTA and how you can make this work. And if you are looking at this video, you probably have tried Arduino OTA and for some reason it doesn't work on your sketch. Well, if it works on your sketch, well, happy for you. But I wanted to explain what was the issue for me, and it took me, well, quite a lot of testing and reading and trying to actually figure out what has gone wrong. So I want to talk about a couple of different things here in this video. The first one is what you should do or what you can try if you included the Arduino OTA in your sketch, but you don't see the network port, because that could be an issue. So that is something in the Arduino IDE. The other thing is what you should do, or what are the issues when you are trying to do an update, but you are getting different messages. So you could be getting a message which says no response from the device, and that message is probably related to firewall settings. So for example, for me, even though I created a custom rule in my firewall that it should allow these OTA traffic through, it is not doing that. So what I ended up doing is actually I disabled the firewall just for the time, well, just for the period when I do this update. I probably need to, do some more tweaking on my firewall to fine tune that rules, because disabling the firewall has the issue that what happens if you don't enable it back. And of course, well, the firewall is disabled, so that shouldn't really happen. So that's one of the issue. And there was another similar problem is I was also getting an error message which said no answer. So here it came back with a message no answer. And that was an issue related to the fact that the Arduino OTA actually started, but during the OTA process, the ESP short dumped. And that issue was related to the fact that in my code, the Arduino or the ESP was doing an interrupt, a timer interrupt. So when the OTA was happening, it was also doing some of my code, and that basically caused the conflict. And I could resolve this issue by disabling the timer when the OTA starts and re-enabling it when the OTA ends. And with this small modification, the OTA started working for me. So first of all, let's talk about what happens if you don't see this network port. Well, it could be many different reasons. I've read posts where somebody said they just reinstalled the Arduino OTA IDE and it started working. For me, the issue was that in my house, I have a couple of different routers, just because one doesn't have enough Wi-Fi coverage, and I don't have some fancy setup. Basically, I just have the main router, which is provided by my ISP, and in the garage I have a separate one which is configured as a bridge but still works as an access point. So I can see the traffic, and there is no separate subnet on the other Wi-Fi router, but it just creates a different SSID and a password. And what seems to be the issue is that the devices that are connected to the other router, they don't appear in the network port. So what I did as a workaround is whenever I want to do OTA, I just change my Wi-Fi settings so I connect to that router with my laptop as well, and then all of a sudden these devices show up in the network port. And again, it might depend on your router. You might have a separate setup. You don't have this issue. Sometimes you can have this issue if you have a separate router for 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz. The ESPs are obviously connected to 2.4 gigahertz. So again, you should be using the same Wi-Fi network as your ESP devices if you have this type of issues. So these are the things that you should try out if you are not seeing your devices. The next issue, as I said, is when you get a no response from remote message when you try to do so. What once you see the network port, you select it, you click on upload, and you see or you get a no response from device. Well, based on the different discussions, that is most probably a firewall issue. As I said, I tried setting up some special rules in my firewall, but it didn't help. So what I'm doing for the time, well, for the period when I'm doing the sketch updates, I disable my firewall and I upload, and then I re-enable the firewall. Just make sure that you re-enable the firewall. The other thing you can do, I mean, if you want to set up these firewall rules properly, then what you can do is, if you look at the sketch, how the Arduino OTA looks like, there is a definition here, which is in the example it's commented out, which is setting the port for the OTA, and by default it's 8266. So you can change it to a random port, and then configure that in your firewall rules. Just make sure that all of your Arduino OTA sketch uses the same port, or you configure port 8266. And the third issue is when you are getting a message here, you see it says no response from device, so that's what I just mentioned. But sometimes you get a message which says no answer. And I was getting these messages, and then, as I said, the issue, well, the reason, or sorry, the root cause of that message was that when the OTA started, actually my ESP short damped. And there is a way how to find this out. And as you can see, I'm doing that right here now. So the way for you to check what your ESP is doing when it's doing the OTA is you go into Tools, and in the board definition, you select the debug level. Actually, you set it to OTA, and you select the debug port to serial. And then when you open up the serial monitor, you will see messages. You see your regular messages, but you also see messages that are sent by the debug level. So for example, the state changes is not something that is included in my code, but it is there because of the debug level. So you set your code, your sketch to this debug level and the port, and then you flash it using the port. So you flash a version which creates all these extra debug messages, and then you use a terminal program which is not Arduino IDE, which is not the Arduino. So for example, you do putty. Oops, I did twice, and then COM port. It's COM9 for me, and you can change the speed. I mean, I usually set 115200, and the open, and then you use this to monitor your ESP. I mean, your ESP at this point is still connected to you using just a USB cable. And now you can initiate an OTA using Arduino IDE, but now in this time the network port. So you just basically do whatever you normally do. You upload, and then you also monitor in the COM port. And what you should see is, normally what you will see is that the sketch is getting uploaded here, but you also see the progress in the COM port as well, so in the serial monitor as well. So this is how it should look like. And what I noticed previously is that whenever the progress started, or in between the progress, my ESP was short damping, and that's the only way you can see this if you are monitoring it externally, not from the Arduino IDE. And then reading different issues on GitHub, I realized that the reason the short damp is happening because I have an event callback in my code. So I created a timer. Well, I actually am using this timer in most of my ESP codes. And if you haven't used a timer, it is really easy to set up because you create a function. In this in my case, I've created a function called timer callback, and I set up this, I specified this function for this timer, and then I armed the timer saying that it should call this callback function every 1000 milliseconds. So all I needed to do is I needed to go back to my code above where I do the OTA definition, or actually the OTA event callbacks. And so on the Arduino OTA on start, by default it just says serial print start, and I included this line, so OS timer disarm, and end my timer. So I disarm the timer when the OTA starts, and then when the OTA finishes, I just restart the timer to, whatever was before, whatever I normally have it in the setup. So technically, when the OTA happens, I don't want ESP to do anything. Well, timer and processor related. So this is all I had to do, and Arduino OTA started running. And since we talk about the Arduino OTA, I just wanted to add a few of my comments and how I'm using it at the moment. So first of all, I don't know if it really makes any difference or not, but in one of the issues, they said that the Arduino OTA definition should be right after the Wi-Fi setup, so the Wi-Fi connection. So previously I had it further down in the code, so I just moved it above. So, wherever I have all the Wi-Fi begin and, checking whether I'm connected to the Wi-Fi, I set up the OTA right in the beginning. So first is I already talked about the port. So, maybe you can just pick a different port other than the default 8266. So you can just have, that set in the firewall settings. By the way, since we are talking about a firewall, I think I've done testing, so I'm just going to re-enable my firewall. Also, you have this host name for the Arduino OTA, and by default, it's going to be ESP8266 and a chip ID. And that is fine, but if you have multiple devices, then you wouldn't really tell which one is which. So what you can set it to just a fixed value. But if you have multiple ESP devices that are going to be running the same firmware, what I have done, I've created these few lines of code which is going to use a client ID, which I usually define in the global variables because I'm using that client ID for the MQTT client ID as well. And I just add the last couple of digits from the MAC ID. So, and that's what I set in the host name. So if we look at the system, you can see that my port is now called the current, so that's the client ID, and then B5AA C, sorry, 8C. So again, if I'm using multiple of these, then I would say, current something and then current something. But if I have another sketch, that would be, something else. So it just makes it easier to identify the different devices. You don't have multiple devices with the same name. So I think that is helpful as well. And of course, something which I haven't done in this particular code as well, but probably it's a good idea that you also set a password for the OTA. So once you set up a password and you click on upload, once it goes to the actual upload, then it's going to ask for the passwords. So that could also prevent accidental firmware update. So I think that would be all for today. It was a good learning for me, but at least I know how to use Arduino OTA when you are also using timers in your ESP code. Thanks for watching, and hopefully see you in the next video.